The big CrowdStrike and Microsoft outage in July has put a lot of IT teams on notice, and a lot of them are saying, what's next? Coming up on this episode of Today in Tech, we're going to explore some of the other potential tech disasters that companies might face and how IT and business leaders can get ahead of those issues. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Today in Tech. I'm Keith Shaw. Joining me on the show today is Krishna Prasad. He is the CIO and Chief Strategy Officer at UST. Welcome to the show, Krishna.
Hey, Keith. Great to see you.
Hey, yeah, we had a lot of great conversations on the pre-call, so I'm hoping that this will go just as equally as well. But let's jump right into this whole CrowdStrike and Microsoft issue. Not necessarily on the technology stuff that happened during the thing, but more about the after effects. And so you're on the West Coast. You're in Southern California, correct?
I am.
Yeah. And so within the CIO and IT leader community, was this outage in July an earthquake or a tremor in terms of its impact? And how did it affect your company, at UST?
Yeah, funny you should, bring up earthquakes and tremors because yesterday I was sitting right here in my office and we had a 4.4 magnitude earthquake out of Pasadena.
Yeah.
And you could certainly feel it out here. So, but in many ways, if you think about the CrowdStrike event, I would definitely view it as something more than just a tremor, in the sense that, I wouldn't say necessarily buildings came down, but certainly things fell off the shelf. A couple of pipes or two, broke as a result, and we had to fix it. So I would say to a large extent, it was a way that it is a reminder for us that we, for example, in our case, that we are living along a fault and we do need to be prepared, right? So in many cases, CIOs in general are always thinking about what could potentially go wrong within their environments and preparing for it. And this was a reminder that, hey, things actually can go wrong. And it was a little bit of a test run, if you will, as well, on some of our preparedness procedures and so on.
Do you think it was a bigger deal for others in that CIO and IT community, the people that you talked to? Did you feel like you did feel like it was a tremor or a little rumble from your angle, but do you think that other companies, it was more of a wake-up call? Or, do you know anybody that had a bigger impact?
No, absolutely. And I think, with all of these things, unfortunately, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It has impacts different depending on the business, depending on the types of customers you're serving, depending on the operating environment that you're involved in. So for us, if you look at it in specific, given that we provide services to other organizations, what we had was, of course, we had to deal with endpoint outage and getting the BSOD issues resolved and getting people back. But I think we are all aware of companies like Delta, which had a much bigger operational impact, and many airlines. And it's funny, almost most CIOs that I spoke to talked about either themselves or somebody that they knew really well who was stuck at an airport and seeing blue screens.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think the impact has been varied, and it's another way that it also reminds you that the level of preparedness that you have for these situations can also go a long way in terms of how quickly you can recover. For example, if you look at our environment, I would say our teams, we've been prepared for things like this happening. So we were able to kind of get some plans going quickly. But for some companies, it never gets enough funding, never gets enough priority. And so all of a sudden, when as they say, the proverbial things happen, then what you find is that you're stuck there and you're trying to. It takes you much longer to recover. So I think it really tends to vary depending on the situation.
So given this impact, are they also? Is there a lot of reflection going on with other CIOs? Are they starting to look internally at their own systems, or is it more of a reaction of, well, at least we're not Delta Airlines, and we probably dodged a bullet here, and we're okay. But yeah. Like, where do you see that, this having an impact long term in terms of the soul searching?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is I end up interacting mostly with CIOs of larger companies. And for larger companies, this is not something that you can, ignore and, take for granted. So in that sense, in many ways, it's a way to reflect on, hey, have we really got everything covered? Have we thought about events which we assumed were once in a lifetime? Are they going to happen more often? Do we need to be better prepared? So there's been more soul searching and reflection. And in many ways, maybe going back and reviewing your key risks and your mitigation strategies around it. But of course, for other companies, maybe smaller organizations that have not spent enough focus around that, it's probably a much bigger wake-up call, right? But I don't think there's anybody out there who can look at what happened here and say that it doesn't matter to me at all. Other than, of course, companies that were not CrowdStrike, customers, they're probably not impacted at all.
Yeah.
So perhaps for many of them, they're like you said, maybe having a sigh of relief.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think for most CIOs, especially for large organizations, you recognize that, hey, what happened there? I know I dodged the bullet this time, but it could happen to me next time, right? So they are definitely going back and looking at those plans.
Right. I think, our company here, we were not affected by it. And again, I hope I'm not revealing any company secrets, but we did not have CrowdStrike. So we were very minimally impacted. I don't think we had any issues with our devices or servers. But that being said, I'll bet you that our IT group is still looking at it and going, hey, I wonder where else we could be impacted. And I would imagine there were a lot of CEO memos that went out to a lot of CIOs that said, okay, so I know we were impacted, A, B, and C, and we were able to fix that. But now let's look ahead and see, like, where else could we be doing? Do you imagine that that's happening in boardrooms across the companies, right?
Yeah, even in my case, for example, I directly just, I think it was that Saturday morning, I had a query from one of our board members asking us, hey, how did it impact us? What have we done? And, where are we in that process? So in that sense, yeah, it's absolutely getting attention, and the questions are certainly being asked. And in many cases, there is also an understanding that it goes beyond just the CIO organization. I think in this particular case, obviously, the CIO plays a very critical role in terms of planning for and having the ability to recover from it. But at the same time, I think there is clearly business disruption. And so it definitely needs to extend into the operational parts of the business. So in that sense, certainly there is, I think, attention being paid. Do
you think there's going to be a big changes that happen for a lot of these companies, or as they finish the review of all of their systems and go, oh wow, we have a long way to go, or do you think that they're going to make small little tweaks to and again, I'm thinking about the technology infrastructure, the device choices that people make, like like, oh well, we're a Windows shop, so maybe we shouldn't be just a Windows shop. Maybe we should allow some of these other devices, or the locations of where they're putting different servers and different cloud centers and things like that. Is this? Are we going to see big changes down the horizon?
Yeah, I think all of those are certainly things, frankly, we are thinking about as well. And I do anticipate to some extent there will be some level of changes. So to your point, ultimately, what you want is to avoid single points of failure, right? And the single points of failure can extend into a variety of different areas. So, I know people, it's a little bit of things that you take for granted, but let's say you take geopolitical conflict. When the whole Ukraine event happened about a year and a half ago or so, there were companies which had a lot of development and engineering capability that was housed in Ukraine that got severely disrupted, right? So they really had to revisit, hey, is having all of my resources in one location, is that something that's important? And the interesting thing is that, as well as during COVID, there was a realization that companies, for example, needed to have an India plus one strategy, right? So no longer can I just afford to have all of my development resources in one location. So I would say the common theme is really around that single point of failure. That can extend now, of course, into, let's say in this case, a Microsoft or a CrowdStrike, and saying, what, should I really have all of my environment around one particular vendor? Yeah. Does it really need to go into a little bit of a broader view than that? And absolutely, all of those elements, I think, is something that we are thinking about seriously. And I would say for most companies, evaluating where some of those risks are that you might not have necessarily anticipated, but at the same time, you're starting to see becoming more prevalent, is very important, right? Something as simple as I'll give you, right, an example. If even having data centers, even if you're not fully on the cloud and you have your own data centers, for example, we've had a client who was primarily based out of Texas, and their data centers were based in Texas, which logically made sense.
Right.
But a couple of years ago, when we had that major winter storm and issues around flooding and things like that, their data centers were impacted, right? So companies are really starting to think about, hey, am I facing these single points of failure in various parts of my environment? And it can manifest itself in a variety of different ways, but we have to evaluate those things.
Right. Now, and again, this might be a stretch or a reach from my perspective, but is it possible that companies that were going through a lot of digital transformation efforts, and I know you're not a fan of this term, I'm not a fan of it either, but it does illustrate a point of, as they were moving a lot of their resources from internal to external, whether it's to move to the cloud or taking paper processes and making them digital, that during that movement, this helped create this single point of failure for a lot of things, whether it's just moving, with a single cloud provider or, data centers that were located in a single spot. Could that have helped, or just using a single vendor for, just to save some money, or to, does that digital transformation effort suddenly then create a new problem, or is that just me reaching?
I don't know if I would necessarily attribute this to digital transformation efforts.
Okay.
Of course, the fact that you have more technology deployed in your environment, and the fact that as a result, your business is more dependent on reliable technology, absolutely is a critical factor, right? But as with any situation, you're really looking at it from a standpoint of, what is the risk and what is the potential impact that I need to plan for? So let's take an example of like aircraft design. So you need to have multiple levels of redundancy in that environment, because you don't want something to go wrong while the plane is in flight and something doesn't work right.
Yeah.
Same thing. Even if you take in this particular environment, I know of I've spoken to other people where hospitals were impacted because all of a sudden they couldn't provide the patient services that they are normally used to doing because they were dependent on the technology. However, they had planned for, in this case, using pen and paper as a mechanism to handle some of that. They also had a situation where, under certain security type of situations, they had to guard certain parts of it, and they had to physically get people to guard the doors, whereas earlier it was just a swipe card. So we had things like that going on. So the way I look at it is, I don't know if it's necessarily just digital transformation per se, but the fact that technology is an integral part of almost everyday life, whether it is business or for consumers.
Right.
I think we just need to be better prepared that, hey, the technology sometimes can go wrong. I mean, just like, for example, we take the power grid for granted, but sometimes you are going to lose power, and what are you better prepared for it, right? So I think from that perspective, I think it's a recognition that systems can fail, and we need to understand what it could impact. And if the impact is severe, we need to have alternate ways by which we can achieve those goals. So I think, in that sense, I think we need to think about it.
All right, so we've covered a lot about the impact and how people reacted and what they're planning for. So let's put your prediction hat on now. Let's start thinking about what other examples do you think that are out there of applications, services, vendors, that could potentially be impacted from an event like this. And I think, before the show we talked, and you mentioned a great one in the authentication space. So talk about that one and then some other potential issues. And I'm going to try to think of some as well.
Yeah. And I think the point that, because to your point, I think we started evaluating, hey, what else could be areas that we need to pay attention to? And one of the areas we clearly identified was around authentication, like you just said. At the end of the day, it is very difficult to have a distributed mechanism by which you can have multiple, authentication mechanism against your environment. So you are by design almost to some extent dependent on, let's say, a single vendor to do that. And if that ends up having a challenge, so then we are forced to look at alternate options. So let's take as an example, every company, I think most large organizations are looking at multi-factor authentication as a key part of their security posture.
Right.
Now, if your MFA server goes down, even if I could log into my environment, I can't authenticate against that, second mechanism, and all of a sudden I can't log in.
Right.
So we've started to evaluate that and say, you know what, hey, for certain very critical systems, do we need to allow for alternate options? Do we need to look at something different? Similarly, if you think about it, most people, I think cloud in general tends to be, pretty reliable, and there is a lot of redundancy and things that is, being built in there. But if you were to extend that a little bit further and say, what could happen if there was a little bit more of a systemic failure within that environment? How could it impact our business? I'll be very honest with you. For a lot of companies who especially have, spent all of their efforts into, let's say, standardizing on a particular platform, they are going to be forced to go back and look at it, because that could have that potential impact that can take their business down.
Yeah.
So I think those are factors that I do expect. So, for example, networking, quite often people do expect that there is, things that could go wrong. So you have alternate lease lines and things like that. But let's say if the connectors coming into your building is just a couple of, areas that it's going to come in, and if those get impacted because of something that happened in your location, it can have a much bigger impact, right? So I think there are points that people maybe are not thinking about on a day-to-day basis, but periodically it is good to go back and evaluate and say, hey, can we either plan for redundancy or some level of alternate option? Or in some cases, it might be just a question of educating the business that we do have this risk and we just need to be prepared for it, so that when if it does happen, that at least people are aware that it could
and I think you mentioned, earlier, there was the issue of the world events like in Ukraine. Wasn't there, and so how much does a company or a CIO need to think about some of these world events and what kind of impact they might have? Because I think a lot of businesses sometimes don't think about that. Because wasn't there like an undersea cable that was cut during one of these events? Whether you can't prepare for that, but you can have a backup plan, right?
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, we certainly saw that, and in fact, it was like in this particular case, funny that you should mention that, because actually it was one of the cables that was going through the Middle East area, and I think it was the Houthi rebels or something like that who deliberately went and did something there. The good news is, I think a lot of the internet traffic does get automatically rerouted, so in that sense, things work, but it does have an impact in terms of performance and what ends up happening to systems as a result of now, a key connection not being available. Now, I don't know if you can necessarily anticipate all world events, but I think, going back to our earlier comment to say, hey, do I have these single points of failure, whether it can be locations, whether it can be providers, whether it can be other elements, and planning for alternate options around all of that, I think is the best that most of us can do. And to some extent, I think you just have to say, I just hope that an asteroid doesn't come down on us or something like that, right? So there are only so many things that you can plan for. Right. But I think, like with any environment, we have to evaluate the probability versus the impact. And if it's a very low probability and a low impact, you're typically not going to be able to do a whole lot anyway. Yeah. But if it's a very high impact area, you may still need to go back and look at it, even though you've assumed that it's a very low probability event, right? So I think those are some considerations.
Yeah, considering that balance, it was when you brought this up, as a CIO, how do you balance this strategy between, making sure that you're covered for these high probability events, but then also, you sort of have to think about the asteroid strike, but not necessarily plan around it, because at that point, it doesn't matter anyway. But, I could see a lot of IT leaders going, all right, so now maybe this is my chance to grab as much budget as I can, because we've gotten these single points of failures and I need to start spending money. You can't get so super redundant, because that's just going to cost the company, millions or millions of dollars. So how do you balance, kind of, is it just make a priority list and then see how far you can get down that priority list before the CFO comes in and goes, all right, you don't have to worry about the asteroid strike, Krishna?
That's right. Yeah. So, like I said, I think for us, and I think for most large organizations, typically that's what they're doing as well, is to evaluate, hey, what is the probability of an event taking place versus what is the impact. And it would be irresponsible if there was a high probability event and a high impact event if you're not planning for it, right? So in many ways, that's the structured approach that we would take, is that we would say, hey, what is using the classic quadrant type of analysis, the top right is something that you absolutely have to plan for, you absolutely have to be prepared for, right?
Yep.
Then you're going to start to move in different directions. Now, if I have a high probability, relatively low impact, what can I do to help mitigate that, or the other way around, right? So low probability, high impact, what can I do to mitigate? So you're using a very similar structure when you evaluate all of these risks. And you can now take that into multiple parts of your environment, right? So you can look at it, for example, we've done that type of analysis specifically around, cybersecurity and our preparedness, because we know that it's a, high likelihood event.
Right.
And a high impact to the business. But at the same time, do we really expect that, 2 of our data centers can go offline at the same time and, have a problem? It's less likely, but, you have to evaluate that from time to time and say, perhaps do we need to take some alternate measures and things of that nature?
Yeah.
So I think it's an ongoing process. And much like everything else, a CIO who understands at the end of the day the impact to the business and is able to have that business conversation with their fellow leaders is able to, I think, get everybody on board in terms of, on the one side, additional budget to fix it, or on the other side, accepting and being prepared for it, right? So I think it's something that I would see that we'll have to pay attention to.
And how often do companies review these plans once they've made them? Is it they finish the book and then just kind of store it away in the cupboard and let it collect dust, or do they bring it out when an event like this happens and then that's when they do the review? Is after someone else gets it's hit? And do you think that they'll be doing more of these reviews?
Yeah, I think for most companies that I've worked with or I've engaged with, they typically have quarterly reviews of, typically it's the ERM approach, right? So the enterprise risk management.
Yeah.
So they're evaluating their key risks at the enterprise level and saying, what are some things that might have changed from the last time we met? What do we need to go back and tweak? We bring some of that inputs into this. Typically, for most companies that have a little bit formalized board structure, the audit committee, for example, will ask those questions. So typically, from what I've seen, it's a quarterly review that takes place. But I would say it's useful to probably take a little bit of a deeper dive look into it, at least on an annual basis, so that you're constantly refreshing that based on things that are continuing to evolve, right? So, for example, while today people might not be thinking about the risk of, let's say, my private public keys being compromised as part of my security protocol, with quantum computing, there's a potential that it's going to get touched, right? So while it is not readily available today, I would say 5 years from now, potentially it's something that we may need to pay more attention to, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's one of those things where as technology evolves, as world events continue to transpire, we have to pay attention to that, and any responsible organization has to evaluate that.
All right, and so the event that the CrowdStrike outage happened on a Friday, and how much of that had an impact on it? The day and the time from the recovery standpoint. In addition, it feels like in companies that have either remote or hybrid workforces, Friday is one of those days where most people are not in the office. Right. I'm not gonna lie here. Mondays and Fridays are generally low attendance days. In the office.
I know what you
here.
mean.
Yeah. So didn't that have an impact where most of your employees, if they had a desktop that was affected by this or a notebook, if they were in the office, if this event had happened on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, the recovery time would have been quicker, right? So, is that an issue that might happen that might be affected these policies, or is that more of an HR thing down the road where you don't want to get involved in that kind of stuff?
So, see, at the end of the day, in terms of the policy definition itself, CIOs would have inputs into it, but typically it's not a technology-driven, policy, right? So typically it is with the HR and the broader needs for the business. The CIO plays a role in terms of enabling that policy and allowing that to be implemented effectively. Now, if you go back and look at our own business, you're right. We certainly do have the number of people coming into the offices tends to be a little bit lower on Fridays. We ended up having to do a lot more remote support as a result. But the funny thing is, in our case, we found that a lot of people came into the office on a Monday to kind of get this thing figured out.
Right.
Now,
and again, I don't want to get anybody in trouble at your company, but weren't you saying that a lot of people logged on, saw that they had this blue screen of death and said, "That's it, I'm done for the weekend," and then like we'll let Krishna fix this on Monday when I come in.
I can't say that it probably didn't happen, but like you said, I don't want to get anybody in trouble here either. But the interesting thing is, for many businesses, it doesn't matter whether it's a Friday or a Monday, right? So, for example, classic, healthcare providers, or if you look at, anybody who's in any kind of restaurant, hospitality business, for them, there is no such thing as a, Friday. And in some cases, Friday could even mean an increased emphasis around the business, and as a result, how people are paying attention. So I think it does tend to vary depending on the business. For us, it did help that it was on a Friday because on the one side, people think about the endpoints and the BSOD situation there, but it impacted servers as well, right? So we had to go back and recover a lot of our servers.
Yep.
And the fact that we had relatively lower traffic on that day allowed us to have a slightly lower business impact and allowed us to recover and bring our server environment back online a little bit quicker than, it might have happened on another day.
That's a really good point. If Friday was a slow day for the company in terms of e-commerce and sales, it could have been more devastating if it happened on a Wednesday, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Excellent point.
That certainly tends to. Yeah. That cyclical element is a little different for different industries, though. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to ask you about some advice for leaders that might have had a bad experience during this outage. What kind of advice would you give them to make sure that they don't fall into another disaster? Have you talked to anybody yet that had a really bad time? And what kind of advice would you give to any or smaller companies that may have had a rough time during this?
Yeah, I think this, frankly, in many ways goes back to the age-old paradigm of people talking about always focusing on the urgent and not the important. So in many ways, what ends up happening is if you're not prepared for some of these situations, you're likely to be more impacted. So the biggest thing that I would say is it's something that you have to have the rigor to go back and be prepared so that when the event does happen, that you can handle it much more effectively. And that is always an important aspect, but it never gets prioritized because of the fact that it's never urgent at any given point in time until it actually happens, right? So I think preparedness to me is very, very critical. The second element that I would say is the broader relationships that you have, both in terms of your vendor ecosystem. So for example, the supply chain that many CIOs depend on today, right? Whether it's in the technology providers or the service providers or other partners that they are working with, there's a clear dependency on that. So understanding that, these risks are not limited to your organization and extending that to both build relationships as well as understand potential points of failure in other areas.
Yep.
And being prepared for that to me is key. And then I think, like we talked about a little bit earlier, periodic review to make sure that it's a world that is constantly changing, right? So especially now with AI being brought into the mix in many parts of every business, it is changing very, very rapidly. So being prepared for that, periodically reviewing that and updating these plans certainly goes a long way in terms of organizations that can handle this effectively versus the ones that can't.
You queued up my next question for you. Just we're talking about partnerships, and so did you go out and find all of your key partners and ask them, all right, hey, what are your plans in case A, B, or C happens in the future, or do you have a lot of those meetings or just emails going back and forth, basically? Not only for like the partners that you you use, but then also you're probably then talking to partners that might be asking you these questions as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, we've certainly had our clients reaching out to us and asking about our level of preparedness around this, which we've had to respond to.
Yep.
And then we are doing the same as well. Like, look, especially to your point, going back and looking at what are the key partnerships that we are very dependent on, and going back and validating that, they have robust mechanisms to handle these types of situations. How are they going to deal with it? And what is interesting is there's a couple of companies that have proactively started to do that, right? So they're saying, hey, we want to give you some level of assurance around the things that we are doing. Here are 3 webinars that you can join any one of these webinars to hear more about what we are doing, right? So I think there are different types of ways companies are responding to it. And I think, for us, it's definitely something that we are paying attention to.
And these are probably friendlier conversations that you have with people versus the type of conversations that are going on between Microsoft, CrowdStrike, and Delta at this point, right? Because that's a lot of finger pointing and blaming, right? It's probably easier to have a conversation before something goes wrong, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. But as you and I know, at the end of the day, even in a marriage, right, it's all great until it gets to a lawsuit.
Exactly.
And then all bets are off.
All right, Krishna Prasad, thanks again for joining us and giving us some insights about what was going on in the CIO suite for a lot of these companies. I appreciate you being on the show with us.
Absolutely. Delighted to be here. I really enjoyed the conversation and appreciate the opportunity here as well.
All right, cool. Thanks again. That's all the time we have for today's episode. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and add any thoughts you have below. Join us every week for new episodes of Today in Tech. I'm Keith Shaw. Thanks for watching.